Thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn Women of Color on the Front Lines, our first event for Ellipsis 2020. The Ellipsis Institute was founded 3 years ago on the campus of Case Western Reserve University and the Flora Stone Mather Center for Women. Our ultimate goal is to build relationships across lines of difference in pursuit of a common goal. And that common goal is advocacy for all women in all roles on campus. We hope to provide connections and relationships that help to build a support network, navigate barriers to access, and also inspire co-conspirators to join us on our journey towards gender equity. Our terms of engagement today, we will ask you to please place your pronouns, if you desire to share them, in the participant box next to your name. Also, feel free to use the chat box to agree, to drop resources, to just build community with the other folks that are joining us today. Dr. Ray, our conference strategist, will be working the chat, tuning in to capture all of your comments, responses, and feedbacks. To ask your questions, also, please drop them in the chat box. We will have time for Q&A at the end of today's session. Who identifies as a woman of color? The political term woman of color surfaced in the violence against women movement in the late 1970s. Its purpose was to unify all women experiencing multiple layers of marginalization, with race and ethnicity as a common issue. In today's sociopolitical context, the use of women of color, and particularly with the X, is inclusive of those who identify as cisgender, genderqueer, gender nonconforming, transgender, and or femme, i.e. people who may use she or her pronouns. Woman with an X is often used by those who identify as part of the intersectional feminist movement, and it's written with the X to be intentionally subversive to the Eurocentric and patriarchal dominant narrative, and to transcend social constructs by uniting through relationship those women with the following shared global experiences: cultural appropriation, economic disenfranchisement, genocide, loss of autonomy, militarism, targets of war and police states, physical displacement, race, class, and gender-based oppression, and a stolen legacy. So this year's theme is If They Come in the Morning. In 2020, the threat to us as women and femmes of color and all oppressed people is arguably the highest we've experienced in our collective lifetime. We are being targeted via legal policies, media outlets, even systems, institutions, and individuals whom are expected to represent, serve, protect, and care for us. This year's conference theme, If They Come in the Morning, is taken from the inmate communication between two of the most iconic activists of our time, James Baldwin and Angela Davis. Used as a salutation in a letter penned to Davis while incarcerated, Baldwin eloquently calls us to collective action. If we know we must fight for your life as though it were our own, which it is, and render impassable with our bodies the corridor to the gas chamber. For if they take you in the morning, they will be coming for us that night. So building on last year's theme, it has always been the work of the Ellipsis Institute to create space for women of color as we build relationships across lines of difference. In order to continue to do that, we have determined that we must do these four things, particularly in Ellipsis 2020 with our events, but to ground us, moving us forward. We must clearly and unequivocally state that Black Lives Matter. We have and will continue to center the experiences of those women, femmes, and gender nonconforming Black folks in all of our work here at the Ellipsis Institute. We must realize and acknowledge the deep American past and our supposed place in the reality of American collective consciousness. We must examine institutional, systemic, and electoral politics, and also examine their effects on intersectional oppressed communities. Lastly, we must actualize our roles as those that are on the line for liberation by doing our own work first to eliminate our continued role and responsibility to ourselves, to this fight, and also to one another. Thank you. I'd like to turn the rest of the program over to today's moderator.
I wanted to give you a little bit, first of all, I wanted to do a territorial acknowledgement. Ohio, for those who are not aware, is Seneca for it is beautiful. And Cuyahoga County means Crooked River. But we are here, and especially as an Indigenous Pacific Islander, I think it's really important that we start our discussion by acknowledging the fact that we are, including people like me as an Indigenous Pacific Islanders, essentially settler. We are part of this settler colonialist issue. So I wanted to begin with that and offer a greeting of Kwe Materu, which is Wyandotte, I believe, for welcome friends. All right, so I've already, again, Buenas Zanhafade, you can see that. I am a board member of the Chamorro Association in the Midwest. Scholar activist. I like to say, because my experience, unfortunately, not unlike many Black Indigenous women of color, has been very traumatic. And so I was disappeared, and that language, Christy will recognize, comes from the dirty wars of Brazil. And the point of disappearance and hauntings, drawing from the sociologist Avery Gordon, who talks about hauntings and the sociological imagination, is that ghosts are frightening because they tend to pop up where they don't belong. And so I often like to say I have refused to cooperate with my own disappearance in and by academe. But I've nevertheless spent approximately 25 years teaching about race and ethnicity, inequality, sexuality, so on and so forth. I am going to be transitioning. I'll be one of the last people to talk to organizing in the community with as a new board member for the Chamorro Association of the Midwest, a new nonprofit. Again, I teach in the Arube Scholars Program and Department of Sociology. And I'm also a proud contributor and member, thanks to Tessa Schwan in OPAL. So I've been really gratified to work with OPAL in the last few months. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background, and I'll try to keep this very short, about where this panel comes from and what the intentions are behind it. So Dr. Shamara and Tessa Schwan and I met at Case Western to discuss our ideas. And Dr. A mentioned that there was this really cool organization that existed at Case where the presidents or the directors, however they were organized, of all the Black, Indigenous women of color or people of color communities and LGBTQ folks, the presidents or directors of those organizations would have monthly or quarterly meetings to talk about, to share ideas, to share resources, and essentially, and this is something that Tess has taught me, to build capacity, right? So that they could be with one another and help strategize for social justice collectively, even as they worked individually with their respective communities, which, as I'm sure the panelists will mention, are also internally diverse. So the idea was, why don't we do a panel where we bring together leaders of various communities of color here in Northeast Ohio, but Cleveland in particular, and this is what brought us today. So the folks are going to be talking a little bit about what motivated them to first become active in their communities, share a little bit about the organizations that they lead, and then again, go back, go back to see above, share ideas, resources, support and encourage one another and our communities, and strategize in the fight for social justice. So in the interim, this panel was actually intended to happen in March. And as everyone knows, what happened was COVID-19. And it's almost, a hackneyed term, we don't see it anymore, that it was unprecedented. So everybody was scattered to the winds. So in reconvening and serving as an opening panel for the now virtual Ellipsis conference, we're regathering together. And I think that in addition to these comments, and because it is a lunch and learn, I'm going to leave it to the panelists what they want to address. But I think there's been so much that's happened in the time between the cancellation of the in-person conference and what's going on now. So it's truly the case, and I have had the pleasure and privilege to participate with all the panelists, with the exception of Chrissy. Chrissy, we're new to one another, so hey, half a day. Looking forward to working with you in the future. But I've been really inspired, felt empowered to work with all of the panelists to mobilize in response to anti-Asian violence, to be part of looking at, within our communities, at issues pertaining to anti-Blackness, but also being utterly and completely in support and part of the leaders in the conversation for the so-called National Reckoning on Race that basically goes back to 1619. Right. I think there's going to be there was in fact a heightened focus on community action, and the panelists were absolutely out in front. And speaking of a deep dive coming from the Marianas, and specifically Guam, which has the deepest trench in the ocean, there's a lot of depth here. So I appreciate, as an islander, this notion of the deep dive. So let me just introduce the panelists, and then I'll come back at the end and talk a little bit about the Chamorro Association. So we're going to start with Tessa Schwan, and they will tell you more in detail about their backgrounds. But, and I did mention to them when we were organizing that I've known these people informally as Tess and Selena and Shamara, and knew they were badasses. But then when I did some additional, and Chrissy as well, I did some additional research for our panel. I was like, damn. I'm saying that right, because I claim my non-coolness and boomerness, and I think my daughter's on the call, Gisela, so she's probably horrified. But in any case, damn is all I can say, shorthand. So Tessa, in addition to being the chair of OPAL, which is the Ohio Progressive, Ohio Progressive Asian Women's Leadership, that really does engage and is very self-conscious about doing work with Asian American Pacific Islanders and DESIs, was also the 2019 Vision for Ohio Fellow. So again, selected for her leadership and her vision. Selena Pagan is the president of the Young Latino Network, or the YLN, and we recently learned and are celebrating her and giving her lots of snaps. Again, Gisela, I apologize, I'm embarrassing you again. I've been doing it all your life, so just deal with it. So lots of snaps to Selena for being a member of the American Express NGen Fellow cohort for 2020. And last but hardly not least, Christine Stonebreaker Martinez, who's the co-director of the Interreligious Task Force on Central America and Colombia. Or excuse me, my best friend would kill me, who's from Colombia, who I think is also on the call, is the United Nations representative at International Fellowship of Reconciliation. So we're going to go ahead and go in order, and I will stop sharing. Tessa, if you want to take it away, and then tag the next person after you. If you can, again, just, we had asked you to talk a little bit about how you got involved in organizing initially, and then talk a little bit about OPAL and the kind of communities and issues that you deal with. And certainly we really want to weigh in and hear from you as people being active on the front lines since COVID-19 and through the current moment as we speak. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Antoinette. I'm excited to share a little bit about my story and my journey, and please, Antoinette, any of the panelists, feel free to jump in, chime in if you have reflections or questions as I'm sharing. Just a little bit about me. I was born in Kentucky to Chinese immigrant parents, and I've lived pretty much most of my life in Ohio since the age of 2. And a story that my dad always reminds me of is when I was starting preschool, the first day of preschool, my dad dropped me off and, was talking to the teacher. And I immediately jumped in and interrupted him and said, "Oh, my dad doesn't speak English very well." And, he laughs about it, but that story makes me think about how, at such an early age, I had already learned that my dad's accent and his background was something I needed to apologize for and to explain to my teacher. So growing up, I never saw myself as an organizer. It took me a long time to even get in touch and embrace my identity as an Asian American, as a woman of color, and to learn, my family's history, learn about the intergenerational trauma that, affects my daily life. And I think starting to learn about that history is what brought me on this path to become a community organizer, which is something that I'm really committed to doing for my lifetime. So as a college student, all of my friends, all my roommates were white people. When I started my career, I worked in a corporate job in Cincinnati and was just kind of going through the motions, thinking I was going to try to climb the corporate ladder, and just really didn't have a good sense of who I was, my identity and how I fit into the world. And it was actually the model minority myth that kind of woke me up. I started being interested in, reading about racial issues and reading about the history of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And I remember being at a conference in my early 20s and hearing the keynote speaker talk about how Asian Americans have come such a long way. From his family had been attacked as Japanese Canadians when he was young, with people throwing rocks through the kitchen window and, yelling horrible things to them in the street. And there was this conference where he said, that doesn't happen anymore. We've come such a long way. And he put these images of Asian CEOs on the screen and said, everything's great now. Everything's going to be just fine. And it made me so furious because I had just, it was just the tip of the iceberg, but I knew that wasn't the complete story of Asian America. And I knew that our community was more complex than that. I knew that we were facing so many injustices and trauma, invisible injustices around, immigration, deportation, poverty, sexualized violence, and all of these things. So his message really upset me, and that was kind of a turning point for me to just dive into my community, dive into trying to take leadership and bring the Asian American community together. So I eventually left my corporate job. I became the executive director of a small nonprofit in Cincinnati. And several years later is when I really started to see myself as a community organizer. There was a moment back in 2014 where a young Asian American girl, 13 years old, had killed herself due to racially motivated bullying. And her name was Emily Olson. She was 13 years old. And I remember just feeling so impacted by her story of this, school district, this institution that had not protected her and had protected her bully. And just, the isolation that I knew that she had felt, and that it just gave me flashbacks to my own childhood, wanting to assimilate into white culture. So that was one of the early moments that I had organizing, even before I knew that was organizing. The community rallied around the family, and we were packing the school board meetings. I showed up to one of the meetings and delivered a big stack of petitions to the school board. And yeah, we were just really trying to bring the community's voice to put pressure on these people in power to take accountability. So that was one of my early experiences. After that, you know, I started a relationship with, you know, my partner, who we've been together for 7 years. He's a Muslim Pakistani American cisgender man, and I think that my relationship with Muslim Americans has also been really influential in the way that I move about the world, the issues that I care about. And there are many Asian Americans who are Muslim. Indonesia actually has the largest Muslim population in the world, which a lot of people don't know. So when Donald Trump started running for office and all of the horrible things he was saying about communities of color, that was another turning point. And I feel like when I look at my own evolution as an activist and an organizer, it seems like I've had like a series of awakenings, a series of you know, breakthroughs, you know, first around race, then around politics and power, and, you know, more recently around the power of community building and organizing, so that, you know, each of our communities, we can build collective power as a way that social change happens. So I've learned as a Vision for Ohio Fellow a lot about the history of movement building. I've learned a lot about how social change has happened in the past, and learned so much from the example, the wisdom, and leadership of Black organizers, Black women and femmes, Black queer organizers who have really paved the way and brought civil rights to so many. Because, you know, it was just recently that I learned that people from Asia weren't even allowed to immigrate to the U.S. Until the Civil Rights Act had passed. So before that, there were severe restrictions on people coming over to the U.S. from Asia. And after the Civil Rights Act passed, that's what made it possible for the Immigration Act of 1965. So that's how my family was able to immigrate here in the 80s. But that history, right, was hidden from us. It's not taught it's not taught in schools. It's not taught on the citizenship test. And yeah, so the kind of the erasure of history, the history that's kept from us purposely, that's something that makes me extremely angry, and that's something that I hope can come out of this this moment of national reckoning, as we are, you know, protesting and making collective demands around prison abolition, around, you know, abolishing white supremacy. I hope that we are also able to make demands around the state of our public education, and all of the other ways that our culture and our society teaches young people about their history. So those are, yeah, just some some pieces of my story. As Antoinette mentioned, I lead a group called OPAL. We're a grassroots organization, and we're building community with Asian American and Pacific Islander women and non-binary people across the state of Ohio. So we're a statewide organization, and we're organizing our people for social justice. And we believe we can do that through elevating our voices, visibility, and progressive leadership, while building solidarity, building relationships with Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. So it's been just a life-changing experience to be part of OPAL. As I think about, you know, the future vision and sustainability of this organization, it's really shaped how I see myself, and the role that I want to play. What we've done so far in terms of trying to build power has really been around first community building. So, in a place like Ohio, it's often, depending on where you are in the state, it's really hard to find other people, other people of color, other women of color, other queer people of color. And so I think one thing I've heard is just existence is resistance. So the idea that, even the people on this call, all being in the same space together, I think that's a really powerful form of resistance, and it opens up so many possibilities. Whereas before OPAL existed, there wasn't this avenue for people to find each other. We also believe so strongly in art and storytelling. So the connection between art and activism, and the role that artists can play in, painting the vision for a future, to change hearts and minds. We focus on political education as well. So giving people space to learn together about what organizing is, what movement building is, and to learn from, previous movements for civil rights. Also learning that there is this legacy of Asian American Pacific Islander feminist activism in the country that goes back, over 100 years. So kind of challenging that narrative that that our people never show up, that our people have never been part of this fight. We know that that's not true, even though there is apathy and there is conservatism and white supremacist thinking in our community that we have to fight against. And lastly, organizing campaigns. So trying to mobilize our people around specific issues, whether it's been, trying to fight to protect family-based immigration, as the Trump administration has always tried to, from the beginning, we know that they want to eliminate immigration altogether, but as a way to get to that endpoint, they're trying to shift towards merit-based immigration. So saying that, family members don't have merit or family members don't have value. We're really trying to promote family unity as an important cornerstone of a really just and humane immigration system. This year, as COVID-19 was starting, as early as January, February, our community members were feeling the impact. We were feeling so much anxiety and fear and just this collective trauma around just, first of all, knowing that people were being attacked, and not just people of Chinese descent. There was a data set of over 2,000 incidents that showed over 60% of the people reporting incidents actually were not Chinese. They were, Southeast Asian, they were Pacific Islander, they were Filipino. And so it was just this phenomenon that was impacting people of all ages, people of all different ethnic backgrounds. And the amount of gaslighting that we were seeing, people denying that this was an issue, as well as saying, this was a new issue, saying that this was a rise in anti-Asian hatred and xenophobia that we've never seen before, which is not true, right? If you look back again to the history, you would know that there were entire Chinatowns that were burned down by white supremacists in the late 1800s, and there were, horrific hate crimes going back every time there was, some kind of national crisis or some kind of conflict in different parts of the world. So, I think looking back, the organizing that we did around that issue, I'm very proud of the community members that came together to take a stand against it, including the Ellipsis Institute, which, I can't even describe how it felt to see the statement of support that they put out in solidarity with OPAL. There's just no no value, no way I can quantify like how much that impacted me personally and other people in our community who saw it. But since the murder of George Floyd, I think it's just built upon that collective pain and trauma that we had brought our people together around earlier in the year. I know many OPAL members became first politicized around the murder of Tamir Rice. And so that was many people's entry point into social justice and racial justice work. So when the George Floyd protests first started, we were just hearing from all parts of our membership, all parts of the state, that we wanted to bring AAPIs together and just determine, what our role was going to be in this movement, because we did want it to be a permanent, prominent part of our work. So that's really integrated through all of our organizing and programming. We've had, an introductory racial justice teach-in to talk about where AAPIs fit in the movement for Black lives, and just continuing to try to build those relationships. So I've spoken a lot, but
right.
If there are any questions, I can answer them later.
All right. Tessa, thank you so much. It's really a nice way to shift to the next panelist, who will be Selena Pagan. And I know that I was very excited to share space, break bread in an event with the Young Latino Network with Selena as at the helm, along with Tessa. It was called in an event called We Will Eat With You, to address the question of invisibility of Asian Americans, but also to call upon this notion of solidarity and coalition building. So I really want to recognize YLN and Dr. Arki and Tessa for moving us forward to the next discussion about doing solidarity, as well as, again, going into a deep dive about your own activism and where it came from. So Selena, if you could move us to the next discussion. Thank you again, Tessa.
Hi, everyone. Selena Pagan. I am the president of the Young Latino Network. I'm also, my day job is economic development and marketing coordinator at Metro West Community Development. First and foremost, then YLN, but YLN has been my life for the last couple of years. Yeah, when Dr. Arki admitted everyone and I see the names and I see the faces rolling in, I got super hyped. I'm like, oh, this is sweet. Like, I could feel the energy, even though it's virtual. Like, I know that we're here for a reason. And so I'm born and raised Cleveland. I'm Puerto Rican. And a lot of my work has been around like the Latinx community here in Northeast Ohio, and doing a lot of work just organizing around issues that impact Puerto Rico and like the Puerto Rican community here. Cleveland, I like to say Cleveland is a small, big city, right? A small group in Cleveland can make a big difference. And so I think that has motivated me in my work in doing what we do. I have sat, I don't even want to say I've sat at tables. The folks on the panel today have created their own tables for us to sit at, right? And that has been the most powerful thing, is that we're no longer trying to get invited to tables, we're making our own damn tables, okay? And so like a lot of my work revolves around that, is building solidarity amongst each other in our communities, because we know that our communities have gone through so many things, all of us, and all of the work that we do, right? We are at a point where we're taking all of that, all of our energy and all of what we give into our communities and coming together to do collective impact, right? At the end of the day, our work is liberating work, and we're working towards liberation for our communities and ourselves through this. And so I know for my, being in this space for a couple years now, I got into like doing this nonprofit work stuff 6 years ago, right before I started my studies at CSU. And I worked for a Latinx organization, a Latinx led and a Latinx serving organization. I was there for a couple years, and then I graduated CSU. Right after I graduated, I attended my first REI training. And I was like this young Latina in this nonprofit and like networking and doing all this stuff, and I was wet behind the ears. I was naive. I was going through the motions. I started this work when I was 18. I said stuff that others were like, we don't say that here, or we don't talk about that in front of these people. And I didn't understand all of this, right? I was young, and I was being I had mentors, right? I don't really believe in this mentorship thing, but I had people who were telling me how to behave or how to act or what to say or what they think of others, right? And how we collaborate and do work, right? So I really early on, I had an understanding of how this whole, how our community functions, and kind of understanding why things are the way they are, and acknowledging a lot of these challenges and personalities and leadership has been a process, a learning curve for me as a young Latina in this space. I know that I'm a voice for my community. I know that I position myself to be a leader. And I know a lot of people don't like that because I think differently, because I believe that we need solidarity and social justice and racial equity and all of these things that like different folks who've been around longer don't understand. And so I know that I was coming in stirring the pot, as I was told yesterday. And I'm okay with that. I think that part of this, like for me in my journey, when I took my first REI training, like that was a really big moment for me as a person. But it wasn't until I took the Latinx Challenge, where I went to Durham to take the Latinx challenges on racial justice, that my identity as a Latina woman was really like, it was the reason I quit my job. It was like, oh wait, there's more. Like there's a lot of red flags, and what are we doing? And I just lost it. I went into this whole, especially as a Puerto Rican woman, like I went through like reading books about Puerto Rico and what happened to our people, and all these things that happened that really kind of just lit a fire inside of me. And I didn't identify as an organizer or anything until recently. And so like I did a lot of stuff, right? I've done a lot of stuff in these last few years, and I just things kind of keep, I always tell folks like, man, if I just had like a regular job and made some money, but I do this to myself. I get into all this stuff because I know there's a fight, and I know that there's a lot of good people around the table who are all fighting for the same things for their own communities. And so, after I took a racial equity training, like that sparked a fire in me. And then a lot of the things that, I was reflecting on kind of this organizing thing, and I've realized, for the past couple years, every year there's something that I'm organizing. And usually when it comes to boots on the ground events, or boots on the ground, like organizing, whenever something catastrophic happens in Puerto Rico, that's when I mobilize community members here in Cleveland. And, when we had Hurricane Maria, and organizing candlelight vigils and stuff with that, and trying to understand how the nonprofit industrial complex within our community and that ecosystem functions in these situations, and how like just radical organizing on the side functions, right? And understanding the difference. I'm really well versed within, I know who's leading organizations, who's on their boards, and I challenge a lot of this and hold accountable like people doing this work. But I know that there's a whole nother spectrum of Latinx individuals that are not a part of that nonprofit industrial complex. And so how do we balance it? Because what I've realized in my work is that it's not either or, it's both and. These systems already exist. We're already a part of these systems. We have folks who are in those systems. Sometimes we have folks that go into those systems and are assimilating to the culture of these organizations or public office and stuff like that. But how do we hold them accountable for the things that we need them to do, right, while they're playing in these systems? And so for me, a lot of this work has been understanding who are the players in the game? How are we, like, you know, who's where, kind of analyzing all these organizations and the work that they're doing, while at the same time building solidarity and building leadership that is transparent, that can have hard conversations, and we can argue it out, but at the end of the day, we still got mad love for each other, and we can continue to do work together. And so a lot of this work that I've been doing has been dealing with leadership that already exists, and a couple of generations of leaders that exist in the Latinx community, and really trying to figure out how we align all of them. And I know that there's a lot of folks that won't come to the table, and that's okay. Like, if they didn't come to the table, if they chose not to be there, that's not our fault. Like, this generation of leaders has made it very evident and loud and clear that, like, this is how we want to go about, like, making progress in our community. And so we have some really dope ass people around the table. Like I said, like, a lot of the folks, like, everybody on the panel I've worked with, and we have this, like, this kind of, it's cool, this sisterhood that as women of color, like, we're in these spaces and we, like, reach out to one another and we bounce ideas off each other, and we have really liberating conversations. I see you know, someone that we all work with and who would have been dope as hell to have on this panel is Jennifer Lumpkin. She ties us all together. Like, that woman is a beast, and like, I want her everywhere. And so, but Jennifer is one person, right? And so how do we support each other? How do we support Jennifer, right? Like, there's a lot of folks who aren't on this, you know, panel, but they're out there doing the work, and we know that. And I think that, like, we know that this work is hard. We know that we're battling there's always a battle within our own communities, and then with the external community, and with the white supremacy, like, white dominant culture, right? Like, so we have to understand, like, that's exhausting. Like, this work is exhausting. I know we're all tired. I know that putting this panel together and, you know, trying to figure out how to navigate Ellipsis as a virtual conference during this pandemic is hard. Like, I know that there's all of these issues that we're dealing with. The most liberating piece is that we get to come together and talk through it, and, like, know that, like, we're not alone. And so a lot of this work has been liberating. Like, I know it's exhausting. I know I get anxious. I have mental breakdowns. Like, who doesn't at this point? Like, life is hard as hell. But we know that we're going to do our little piece right now, and, like, we're going to see those. We may not be around to see those seeds grow, right? We're planting seeds, you know, that will someday grow, and we may or may not be around to see it come to fruition. But we know that we're all doing a little piece. And I know I'm all over the place, but I get energy from you guys. So I'm just like, you know, there's a lot to talk about. It's really important that, like, doing our work in our respective communities is important, but doing that work as a collective is even greater. And so we see that, and a lot of the work that we try to do is make sure that we have our folks in the LGBTQIA+ community represented, folks in the AAPI community, folks in the Indigenous, in the Black, in the Arab American, everything across the spectrum, because we know that working in those silos is strategic. It keeps us away from each other. And we know that coming together is powerful, and knowledge sharing is power. And so there's a lot of layers that we need to discuss and, like, have passive communication so that we're all on the same page, because it's complicated. It's not easy, right? Like, the system works really well. And, like, one of the things that we need to understand, and what I faced this past weekend, is, like, understanding that racism works so well. It's like, it does what it's supposed to do, and it's like a virus. It evolves, and, like, it infects our own people in our community, and then we have to deal with those folks who have this internalized oppression, internalized racism that make our own work harder. And so, like, there's a lot of stuff that we need to just acknowledge before we can talk about, like, doing the work, because there's so many things that someone has experienced that maybe I haven't, and, like, oh, that makes sense. So this is why these community members think this way, right? And I think it's really important to know what both sides of the spectrum, you know, is saying and doing and acting on. And so it's been a lot. I've been processing a lot of this stuff, just trying to, like, think of how I'm growing my organization, and I'm growing as a leader in this space. Because it's not easy, and it wasn't meant to be easy. Like, there's definitely is a setup. It's a setup, guys.
Selena, I used to think there's a really famous study that was conducted in the 1970s by the American Association of University Professors, and it shows that women are not coached in classrooms and they're not allowed to talk as often. So I don't know, I'm sort of flipping this upside down, but it makes me so happy to have to interrupt you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because you go on and we want you to go on.
Yeah.
And
No, I will. Like, I will go on.
So,
And on.
I mean, it's both, again, that's the sad part of stepping up to be a moderator is I've got to be the 1 minute, 2 minute warning.
Yeah.
At the same time, I'm going, no, keep going, keep going.
I know, it's okay.
And,
It's okay.
I do want to say that I think I think we need to think about this as the beginning of a conversation. I've seen so many people in the audience that are also, like you said, like this Jennifer person who I don't yet know because I'm new to this space. There's so many badasses in the space. I see my colleague, Nanette Yanutzi, my daughter's here, Gisela McDaniel, fine artist, Joy. There are Maga Hagas, and I'll explain what that means. So anyhow, it gives me actually, in a very strange way, pleasure to be able to say, okay, we need to stop.
No, I gotta respect Chrissy's time.
Let's stop and keep going. And I'm just going to put this out there into the universe. But again, since the vision was to have some kind of umbrella organization, let us start thinking about that. Women of Color, the Ellipsis Institute is an umbrella organization, but I think we need to build and continue these conversations across communities because as heterogeneous as we are within our communities, we need to continue to talk to each other and break bread, so on and so forth. And with that, thank you. Last but not least, and although I will be talking a little bit about the association I just joined as a board member, Chrissy, you're up. And I did warn her in advance in the chat that I will, look at me every now and then, and if I wave a finger at you, that means we've got 2 minute warning one. I'm not trying to be rude because I'm tormented because I want you to keep going. So with that, we're moving on to the next badass on our panel, and that's Chrissy. So I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Mil gracias. Yeah, I'm Chrissy Stonebreaker Martinez. I'm grateful to know a lot of you and be in relationship with a lot of you. Just want to tell you a little bit about myself, like the last two panelists, and then about my work, and hopefully we can have some good dialogue too. So my existence, and we all already know this probably, but our lives as people who exist and resist are mired with trauma. And so if there's anything that I say that gives you some feelings in your body, please feel free to turn your screen off, step away, no hard feelings. If you want to come back to me later and say like, hey, I need to talk to you about this, I'm here for that. But I also want to be real, and I don't want to, and I'm an open book, so there it is. My existence is dependent upon the fact that the country that is now known as Colombia has been in the longest civil war, some say in the world, but certainly in this hemisphere. Violence in Colombia in its present form, and though it's shifted and morphed many times, started with the Civil War in 1964, though that came after a 12-year sort of uprising after a left-wing presidential candidate was assassinated in 1948. And for those of us who are displaced from our indigenous homelands, we know that violence really started with colonialism and the slave trade. So this is hundreds and hundreds of years that we are the result of. So I always say that I didn't choose the movement chose me. Like, I was born into it. My life depends on it. My survival depends on it. I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, and when I say that, I usually get a little bit of credit because it is somehow even more economically depressed than most of our communities here in Cleveland, and somehow even equally segregated. And so I went as a young girl, and my this happens a lot in Latin families or in ethnically ambiguous families, right? Where we have many different colors represented in our families, right? And we have this huge problem with colorism and anti-Blackness that needs to be addressed. But I am probably the most white passing person in my immediate family. And so when I was growing up, you know, going everywhere with my mother and being told not to speak Spanish outside of the house because people would taunt us or tell us to go back to where we came from, or because, you know, whatever reason that they decided. And then going to Colombia and saying, don't speak Spanish because you will be kidnapped because of your accent, and this like this culture of fear, right, that I grew up in, and that I remember really sort of identified the way that I looked at life from my very first memory. And so I always yearned to be following, studying, learning, placing myself in my Colombian indigenous family and friend circles, and going back home as much as possible, though I grew up very poor. So that was really a very difficult challenge, to be separated from my indigenous homeland and to not have the resources to like learn fully what it meant to know that land with fluency. And still, I did go back many times, and I do go back now for my work. But I remember my mom worked at this pizza shop and saved her pennies for 2 years so that she could send me for my quinceañera to Colombia to be with my grandparents. And during that visit, I watched a man be assassinated. And I was supposed to come back home to the US, to Ohio, and worry about prom, right? And so the dissonance between like what my peers were preoccupied with and what I had been experiencing in all these different ways, as someone who grew up in poverty, as someone who witnessed violence firsthand, as someone who is a survivor of assault more than once. And so this dissonance really, you know, it really pained me. And as I mentioned, I tried to find, you know, just anything I could about Colombia. And so I went to college and started learning about US foreign policy and free trade agreements and the ways that colonization were continuing today. And so that was just, that was mind-blowing to me. And I went to college as someone who only has one of my parents and grandparents in total who have a high school diploma. And I went to college as a way to get out, right? And we have this idea that academia will pull us up from our bootstraps, right? All of this BS, right? And so I go to college, study economics, thinking I'm gonna, you know, be able to pay off the $80,000 in student loans that I have. But of course, my purpose, my mission, I couldn't put myself in the corporate world for very long, and I couldn't even put myself in the world of academia for very long. I worked for Kent State for 3 years, and because it was just so demoralizing at so many times, the hierarchies, the bureaucracy. So I have always been an organizer. I've been an organizer. I've been an organizer since the US invaded Iraq for the second time when I was in high school. And I had some friends who were from the Middle East who really supported me on this anti-militarist journey to understand what does it look like to really create a world that that nourishes us. And so Selena said, we need both, and we need to work inside the system and against the system. And what my Indigenous friends and family have taught me is that we need both and inside the system, outside the system, and against the system. And so inside the system, we're fighting for reform. Outside the system, we are trying to actually create what Gandhi called constructive program to nourish things that will really show us what a vision of what the world could look like that we haven't even dreamed before, right? We can't stop dreaming. My compas will also say that hope is my duty. And so I have an obligation to all of my relations to be connected, to honor the land and the people that I'm accountable to. And you know, what's really hard is that other people think, especially systems of power, that other people think that's especially in systems of power, that they get to decide who you are for them, right? I am conveniently white adjacent when it serves someone. I am conveniently indigenous when it serves someone. And I'm sick of other people deciding who I am for me, because I know my own identity, I know my own story, I know what I need to survive, right? And so let me end with my work now is at mostly the Interreligious Task Force on Central America. And IRTF was founded when 2 women were killed in El Salvador, Jean Donovan and Dorothy Kazel, including Jean Donovan was an alumna of Case Western Reserve University. And these were white, well-educated, upper middle class women from the dominant religion of Catholicism. And so their pictures were on the front page of every paper in the United States the day after they were murdered. They had been meeting with the U.S. ambassador to El Salvador the night before they were murdered. He actually jeopardized his career finding their bodies and leading the charge against the U.S. government and their complicity in training and funding these women. And yet, there was a time in their service where I think they left us a lot of writing. And I think that they really started to understand that their work was about solidarity and not charity, because they said, if these children can't leave this situation, how could I abuse my privilege to leave this situation, right? And so what we know now in our organization, as we're fighting for anti-militarism, racial justice, environmental justice, economic justice, gender and sexual justice, right? We're doing all of these things. We're trying to flip the narrative. We're trying to flip the fact that those women would not have wanted their names to be elevated above the 75,000 people who died alongside them, including the majority of the countries of El Salvador's indigenous population, remaining indigenous populations. And so that's what we're trying to do now. Flip these narratives, turn these tables, right? Create our own platforms and build something different. And that difference is consensus-based. It's not hierarchical. It considers consent.
Thank you, Chrissy. I'm going to have to jump in, and I with your consent. Again, I mean, what I find so interesting, I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that I'm starting with an amazing group of people already on the ground. But I think what's amazing about the intersections, truly the intersections and the connections of all the panelists from starting with Dr. Arki and her work. I mean, there's this way in which I think all of us illustrate this connection between identity and thinking about where we fit in history, and then institution building and the complexities of an institution building, particularly when we want to create, we need to flip the script, when we want to engage in solidarity, in coalitions. So I think it takes much more time and intentionality to enter into these conversations with both humility and courage, right? Because we are aware that we are not, even when we become so excited and armed with knowledge and history, we want to immediately run back to our communities. But I think we always need to have some humility that our communities have so many embedded stories that have yet to be told, and that there will be this constant movement between engaging our Manamku, what we call elders, who may not put it the right way, right? They may not have the same language that we've learned, frankly, in some cases within our classrooms. But we refuse to go forward without them, because we know that their stories our stories are part of stories. And to sort of, again, flip the script about whose shoulders we stand on, it's our elders, it's our Manamku, and we're fighting for, I often advise students, and again, it's a occupational hazard, but my entire adult life has been in the classroom in terms of what's been most meaningful. And I often tell young activists who are thinking about and excited and have that fire, like Selena was saying, hey, this is me, right? It's like, look, you may not get it right the first time. You might not get it right 10 times. I've been doing this and I still get it wrong. But the point is that there's somebody who has not even been born who needs you to keep working this, who needs you to keep growing, to continue to be in coalition. The other part, let me go ahead and share my slide. I only have a couple minutes, and I did get to talk a little bit before, but before I do go into the slide.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, this is Dr. Ray. Just a quick question from the chat. And you brought up such a great point, so this is a great segue. I know we're running low on time. We definitely want to honor everyone's time, but Vanessa had a question for Tessa, and it probably applies to the whole panel. So Selena and Chrissy, feel free to jump in. But related to what Tessa spoke on earlier, the question from Vanessa is, do you think the current younger generation is demanding social and racial equity, and how can they get into positions of leadership that are radical and not just for the sake of getting into public office? And so just with the interest of time, which is a great segue to what you just mentioned, Antoinette, Tessa, if you want to jump in with maybe like a one-liner responding to that question, and Selena and Chrissy as well, just very briefly. We definitely want to honor that question in the chat, and that's our only question from the chat. So thank you so much. Sorry to interject.
I think you're muted, Tess.
Oh, thank you. So I thought about this question a lot. I mean, first of all, yes, I do think the younger generation is more radical. I guess I'm not sure what was the specific wording, but yes, the younger generation is demanding social and racial equity. They're not limited by how things have been done. So I'm so hopeful for our youth. Even though our organization is a multi-generational community, we really want to support the leadership of youth and connect them with with the different generations. So the question about getting into public office is interesting because when I first moved to Cleveland in early 2018, or actually end of 2017, I was thinking about running for office, and I was really interested in learning how to navigate the political system, how to make change that way, and I thought that running for office was the way. And I went to these trainings for immigrants and people of color to learn how to run a campaign based on your story as an immigrant, and that was my introduction to thinking about running for office as a way to build power in your community rather than just as a way to earn power for yourself. And I guess I would say I hope that the people, because we do need people to run for office. I think you'll see that from looking at AOC and watching the documentary Knock Down the House. The kind of that's working inside the system, as I think Selena and Christy talked about. but you cannot change the system from the inside unless you are someone who is super critical of the system to begin with. Like that's the only way that I think it's really it's effective. And who are you accountable to once you're in that office? Because, you know, I face this myself with OPAL. You know, sometimes when we are speaking out about issues, there's politicians and their directors that work in their office who call me or, you know, they want to have a conversation about like what we can do. And I find like whenever I see like this is taking up more of my time and taking away my ability to like talk and be in relationship with the community that I really want to spend my time with, like that's where I just have to know my priorities, right? So I think there's a hunger, like, or there's just a common pitfall, like where the closer you get to these people in power, people want to hold on to that. You know, they don't want to jeopardize those relationships. But if you know that you're accountable to the grassroots, to the people, you know, in the community, on the ground, and you just stay true to that, I feel like that's when people serving in public office can be effective.
And I'm going to go ahead and reclaim my time, if you don't mind, because I really want to get to the Pacific Islander community that I represent, at least in this space. So, and then we'll have a couple minutes for questions. There's a way in which a lot of what we've talked about is really engaged in the PowerPoint. Can everyone see my PowerPoint? And I just have a couple slides. Folks?
I think you need to share your screen again.
No, I can't see it.
Okay, let's do this. All right. Because there's a way in which what we're talking about is really addressed, and the way in which there's the importance of young people. Is that available now? Still not available. All right, let me just make a couple quick points. First of all, I think part of what we need to think about as young people and in terms of the youth, as I was mentioning, is doing our work that's place-based. Before the panel started, we were talking about, oh, there's a way in which you almost apologize for being from Ohio or from Cleveland, and I think we have to really stop that. I need, for Pacific Islanders, for example, the critical masses are located on the West Coast, particularly in California, obviously in Hawaii, in the Northwest, and they're often tied to military bases. So, for example, the Chamorro Association of the Midwest, which I just joined, and which is a fairly new nonprofit, it's not surprising that the officers were linked to the Offutt Air Force Base. So it's linked to the military. And whether we're talking about the Caribbean, the Atlantic, to the Pacific, to Colombia, we're talking about empire, right? And the way in which our narratives are erased, and our elders and our artifacts. One thing I'll put somewhere, or I'll get sent out to you, is, for example, the young people in Guahan are fighting the military because they are desecrating ancient artifacts and burials. And, you know, there's this constant asymmetry of power that goes back to the fact that whether we're talking about Puerto Rico or we're talking about Hawaii, American Samoa, we're talking about colonization in Colombia. So with that in mind, I just want to say, since I know we're running out of time, and that already on the chat we've been talking about doing another panel on indigeneity and colonization. So I don't want to completely cede my time, but I do want to mention that Pacific Islanders, and unfortunately this is another sign of it, are often left out of the conversation. We're an afterthought. And as someone who considers myself now an elder, and I've talked to some of the young people, it's like I'm the elder who's out in the field with a machete, cutting down the weeds. And I expect, but we do it so that the young people will take up their place and build institutions. And so with that, ending where America's Day begins, and saying that for all of you who are wherever you're at, do keep in mind that Pacific Islanders who are, again, diverse groups, are nevertheless Indigenous people. We are not just a name, we are not just an add-on, and we have our own issues that are ultimately connected to yours. So thank you for allowing me to reclaim my time. Again, as one of the elders, I do want to toss it back to the young people, the Hoban, relatively speaking, and come back to the question. And obviously to Dr. A, who brought us all together.
So thank you so much to our moderator and to all of our panelists. Thank you all for joining us. The chat is going crazy. It's blowing up in the chat box. You need to get in there. So many affirmations for the stories, the personal stories, the experiences that were shared. That is a part of our work here at Ellipsis, is to take this lived experience and position it as empirical data. We know what we need to get free. We've been taking care of our communities as women and gender nonconforming people since the beginning of time. We've been the ones to get us to where we are. Therefore, we will continue to be the ones to get us to where we need to be. And so I encourage each of us to really begin to dig into your own work. That looks different for all of us based on how we identify, where we come from, who we identify our families to be. But we've got to do our own work so that we can understand our place in this line. We talked a lot about legacy building here, understanding that there are ancestors, folks we know their name, and a lot of people that we don't. We have to recognize them and call on them and have them lead us through this time, through this revolution, and understand that there are folks coming behind us quicker than we think. I'm learning that myself. Quicker than we think. They are here and they are learning and they are ready to join this fight for change. So again, just want to say thank you to everyone who joined us. I have one announcement that I'm going to make, and it's about our session next week. This is the flyer. Our session next week is entitled Both and, an exploration of biracial and multiracial identities. And I believe that this conversation has definitely led us into that conversation. Actually, it's in 2 weeks. I'm sorry, not next week. 2 weeks, July 29th. You can register in the same place on our website at ellipsis.com. We encourage you to share your learnings, share the conversation, keep it going. As we heard, this is just the beginning. We had 75 minutes here. So we knew with all of these dope women that we were not going to have time to get all of the information out, get all the content out. We wanted to start the conversation, and I encourage you to continue it. We've been posting on social media. Please follow us, share, continue the conversation. The last announcement that I do want to make is there is a Defend Black Women teach-in that's happening soon. It's Saturday, July the 25th. It's at 2. The location is there. And also the teach-in is a support for the Defend Black Women March, which is going to be happening on Sunday, August the 30th, kicking off right at 79th and Central in Cleveland, Ohio, Ward 6. So this information is out there. It's on our social media. We'll make sure that you get a mailed copy of it. Please, please, please continue the conversation. Make sure to share this information with someone else and invite them to join us, and have a most successful rest of your day. Thank you all so much.